The China in Africa podcast is brought to you in partnership with the Africa-China Reporting Project at Wits University in Johannesburg. The ACRP promotes balanced, considered reporting on China-Africa relations through training programs held throughout the year. More information at africachinareporting.com.
Hello and welcome to another edition of the China in Africa podcast, a proud member of the Sinica Podcast Network. I'm Eric Olander, coming to you today from lovely New York City. And as always, I'm joined by CGSP's Africa editor, Geraud, from the beautiful island of Mauritius in the Indian Ocean. A very good evening to you, Geraud.
Good morning to you, Eric, from the US.
Yes, good morning, good evening. We're all over the place today. Today we're going to do something a little bit different on the show than we normally do, and it's a kind of show we haven't done for a long time, and I'm really excited to be able to kind of step away from the news and all that's going on in the world and to focus a little bit on documentaries and film and art and some stories and human stories. And Geraud, we often talk about the Chinese and Africans in these very flat ways that removes all the humanity from the discussion. You know, at CGSP, we often say that we think that Africa and China in many ways are bad words because the word Africa alone has a way of flattening a huge diverse continent into a single word that is just, it's irresponsible in some way. We don't have any other way of talking about the continent and the different countries without getting into so much detail, but again, it's so limiting. And so today when we talk about this documentary, Eat Bitter, that's just making its rounds now on the Independent Documentary Films Festival circuit, it's really refreshing to be able to talk about the human stories behind the people that actually make this relationship be so dynamic as it was. And on this question of these documentary films, back in the 2010s, when the China-Africa relationship was really on the up and up, there were a lot of these films that came out, not only in the film festival circuit, but also on networks like Al Jazeera, France 24, and others, where they really started to document the China-Africa relationship. I'd say it's been 5 or 6 years now, Geraud, since we've seen one, so it's really refreshing to actually have these stories start to reemerge.
Yeah, that's true. It's really refreshing to see those human side of the narrative of China in Africa emerging into the debate in the public space. I remember in the 2010s when those stories were made, they were made more into those perspective of not really trying to understand the single story of people. It was sometimes to tell the bad story, sometimes the bad side of this engagement, of this presence in Africa. So that's why I think it was really, at that time, we had a lot of story focusing on work environment, on different issues than the human side of it. So that's why the documentary that you mentioned, Eat Bitter, I really liked it in a way that we have that touch of the human story, the human side of the story, just the story. I'm not going to go into the details because we're going to talk about it, but that's human level side of the story. And when I was watching it, I felt a bit bad for me, especially in terms of China Global South, in terms of also Project Friction, that we wanted to cover much more the diversity of China engagement in Africa, but easily we kind of find ourselves caught in the middle of, like, you know, the geopolitics, the economics, the critical minerals, everything, all the complexity, the big topic that we sometime and easily forgot that there was like those simple human story that needs to be told as well, that tells you the complexity of the China-Africa narrative.
I couldn't agree more. We're as guilty of this as anybody, and so, which is why it's important what we're doing today and to talk about this really important film that I hope you'll have a chance to see. Watching these documentaries is not always very easy because the distribution can be very limited and the film festivals require them to be played in small art houses. They're not necessarily on Netflix or even on the file sharing networks. And I know that sounds horrible for a producer, but if the goal is to get these films seen, having them downloadable is something very, very important. But let me just kind of set the scene here about Eat Bitter in this movie we're going to talk about today. It's set in the midst of the civil war in the Central African Republic. And it showcases a Chinese construction company manager by the name of Luan Jianmian, who is from Shandong province, and Thomas Boa, a local laborer from the Central African Republic, who both work on opposite ends of the booming sand supply business. Now, this sand is used to make concrete that's then used in the construction business. And in many parts of the global south, including where I live in Vietnam, the buildings are all built by just basically massive hunks of concrete. And that's what happens in the Central African Republic. And it requires an enormous amount of sand. And this business of extracting sand from the rivers is brutally difficult. It is just fatiguing. It's painful. And these sand divers like Thomas are also vulnerable to rebel groups, weather changes, and also they live mostly on the far edge of the economy. Eat Bitter tells the story of both men who are each fighting their own battles against poverty, family unrest, and they're doing it in a country that is extraordinarily fragile. This is a country that lives on the edge of chaos on a good day. The documentary is going to premiere here in New York at the Doc NYC Film Festival on November 9th. It's just one of 30 film festivals around the world that it's been selected to appear, which, if you know anything about the film festival circuit, it's not easy to get into one, and so to get into 30 is really quite remarkable. And it has already won the prize for Best International Documentary Feature at the 9th International Documentary Festival Visione dal Mondo in Italy. We are thrilled to have one of the directors, Ningyi Sun, joining us on the line from here in New York, and Eat Bitter's producer, Mathieu Faure from Los Angeles. A very good morning and congratulations to both of you on this remarkable film.
Thank you so much, Eric and Geraud. Here is Ningyi. I am one of the two directors of the film Eat Bitter. I'm so glad to be here, and especially after hearing the thoughts from you and Geraud, I feel this film is really meaningful, and actually what you said reflected why I wanted to make this film in the first place. Like, yeah, these people are just numbers now. 1.5 million Chinese, 2 million Chinese in Africa, but what do we really know about them? So I'm glad that I think my film really answered maybe some of the questions.
Indeed. And a good morning to you in Los Angeles, Mathieu.
Good morning. Thank you for your description. It was just perfect. And now I want to see that documentary.
Yes, well,
It was so good.
It well deserved. But listen, Ningyi, before we get started, I think it's really important that we acknowledge Ningyi's co-director, Pascal Abora Ninkendi, from the Central African Republic, and the film's cinematographer, Orphée Zaza Emmanuel Bamoy, who did an absolutely amazing job capturing the lives of these people. I mean, we were like flies on the wall. And again, for anybody who's been in this space trying to cover the Chinese in Africa and the lives, the amount of access that you had and that your cinematographer and the local crew did in order to make this happen is worthy of an award by itself. I mean, I know firsthand, and Geraud does as well, how difficult it is to penetrate these communities, and the way that it was so natural and they were so comfortable with your crew, it deserves an enormous amount of credit. But Ningyi, let's start with you. Before we get into the documentary itself and the narrative that you told, the story that you told, I think it's worth explaining why you chose the title Eat Bitter. In Chinese, it's called chiku, and it has a very distinct meaning that carries a lot of weight. Why did you assign that phrase to this story?
Yeah, Eric, I think for our generation, I was born in 1989, 吃苦, eat bitter might not be that popular right now, because in China, we will hear a lot of young people talk about 躺平. They do not want to work that hard. They want to enjoy life. They do not want to be stressful. But still, eat bitter, I think, is still the mantra for a lot of Chinese, especially the older generation, and especially for people who work abroad, which means you just suffer mentally, physically for a very long period of time, but you would take it with joy, because in the end you will get money, you will get dignity, and then you will provide a better life for your family. But along this process, you really lose so much. You lose the touch with your family, you lose the touch with yourself. You might even do things that you don't do back in your home country. So I think it really captures the mentality and some value that still a lot of migrant workers hold in their life. And then if we look at Thomas Boa, the other protagonist, he also, it's so much bitterness, but I think there is a stark difference here. I think Central African people, they are happier in the sense that they enjoy the moment and then they might spend what they earn quite quickly. But well, if we really talk about just being happy in this moment, Central Africans definitely do a better job. So even though Thomas also eats bitterness, I think there is a difference here. Like, the two people are not taking this bitterness, with the same attitude. So I also want to just show that difference there as well.
Ningyi, I'd like to go back just one step behind, just a very general, simple question to try to understand, of all the stories of Chinese, of any kind of story you could have made, why did you pick that story and why Central African Republic?
Yeah, Geraud, I was working in Bangui, and then one day I was drinking coffee, and then I saw Ubangi River. It was a beautiful view. And then I saw these local people driving canoes to the center of the river and then back with piles of sand in the canoe. So I was just curious. I know in the frame, it looks beautiful, stunning, but then I want to know what these people were doing underwater, and then what are they going to do with the sand. So I did some research, talked to some people, and realized there is this sand supply chain where on the bottom of it is Tombutu, meaning sand divers like Thomas and all. And then they would have to sell the sand to a dealer, like intermediary. And then a lot of times Central Africans will sell the sand to Chinese, Lebanese, Egyptian Central Africans who would really use it to build concrete and then build buildings eventually. In the beginning, I thought this is interesting to show how Chinese or locals are really working together when we look at those dazzling buildings like hotels, hospitals, banks, how this work is really done with such intensive labor and intensive work. I think that part is hidden from the cinema and from what we know. So that's why I wanted to go there to just film a short documentary to just understand the sand supply chain. But then Mathieu was on board and he encouraged me to find a co-director, find a local crew. So all that just turned into a bigger team and then a bigger project. And then the international cinema showed great interest in this project, which I'm still grateful for, because they know that we do not have cinema like this, like directed by two female directors from the communities. So that really validated our confidence. And then we went to shoot a feature-length documentary.
That's really important that these are Chinese and African female directors as well, and those voices are really important. And you have a very strong narrative in there about not only the struggles of the men, but also the struggles of the women in their lives as well. Mathieu, when we think about the framing of the story and working as a producer on it, how you shaped the narrative, again, the primary protagonists are the two men, but in the background are the women in their lives and the families in their lives that seem to eat bitter and struggle in very different ways, but almost as much.
It's interesting because you are talking about like access and how we find these characters. And yeah, we spent, Ningyi and Pascal spent a lot of time inside the communities and talking to people. And I think that it was really important to find strong characters. And once we talked to Thomas and we talked to Luan, I think that it took like a total different shape once we understood that the secondary characters, women, so Luan's wife and Thomas's mother, would play such an important role in the documentary. And that's how you kind of like build the story, when you have like different layers and when you have different issues that both were tackling separately, but at the same time, we could see how their lives and their struggles were so intertwined. So yeah, we started as a short documentary. And I think that for any documentary, if you want to be successful, what is very important is to have not only like the access, but the story has to be told by people from these communities to have the right tone. And that's what we did.
So, Mathieu, from that producer perspective, when we do know, because Eric was mentioning it a bit earlier, when we do know sometimes, even yourself, you said it, how it's not easy to get access to people, to have those conversations. When I was watching at the document, I was like, that was really quite surprising to see how the protagonists were quite, natural into the interaction, the way they were talking, as if you had professional people in the documentary. I was really kind of baffled. How easy was it for you to to gain their trust and to get access to, so they can open up and they can let you being part of their everyday lives. Especially when I see Pascal's life, when you went to, I don't want to spoil it for the people, but when you accompany him to find his second wife and everything, I was like, how was it for them to just open up and to let you film their lives?
I think it's about trust. It's about, spending time with them, talking the same language, having the culture. Thomas would have never opened up with, let's say, me or even Ningyi. And we had like some issues with Ningyi at first. We wanted like Ningyi to go on set with Pascal. So whenever we were filming Thomas, Ningyi would be there. But after, I think it was once or twice, it became too risky for Ningyi. That was too disruptive to have on set because she was described as a white woman. So the characters would not be at ease opening up in front of her, and she can talk about it. But yeah, so it was very important for us to have Ningyi spending time with Luan and Pascal spending time with Thomas. And keep in mind that for Thomas has never, I don't think that he has ever watched a film. He comes from a very poor background. He stopped going to school when he was like 8 years old. So for him, having a camera, and it was a small crew, there was only like one camera, a Fujifilm, and we can talk about it later. But yeah, there was a simple camera that you typically use to take pictures and not really to film because we didn't have like the means to have a good camera, but we filmed with that camera and there was only a sound person and all of them were from the Central African Republic. So Thomas from the get-go was at ease and we told him, you just have to be natural. We are just going to, follow you. We are not going to disrupt your daily life and just be yourself. And, he spent time with Pascal and Orphée and Aaron, who was our sound person. That's how it worked.
And there was the same with Luan and his family as well, and the Chinese, that they were just as comfortable with you. And again, this is why if I could give you the Academy Award, I would, because I know how difficult that is to do. Ningyi, what is so interesting, and I think may come as a surprise to a lot of people watching this, is how concerned Luan was about his own poverty and his own economic status, and that he is working so hard today in order to save enough money because Luan comes from a generation that remembers how difficult life was. And he doesn't want to go back to that. And he's trying to make as much money as possible in order to save for his retirement because in China, there's really not a very robust retirement system. Can you give us a little bit of background about Luan and that generation and the kind of worker, what he represents among the migrant workers and managers in Africa as to why they're willing to sacrifice so much of their time away from their families and the difficulties that they go through being so far away from home? What's driving them to do that?
Yeah, Eric, I think it was not entirely alien to me what he was doing because even when I was little, my father, he's not in construction or he's a businessman. He was also traveling a lot. And then he might come back home once per 3 weeks, something like that. So somehow, I don't know why for Chinese, it could be a normal thing because you're working abroad, you're working in another city. As long as you provide for a family, you're great. So I feel like there was this understanding that in that sense, it's also quite gendered. Like men, you got to go out, you got to provide for the family. A woman just, safeguard the home and then take care of the children. And then that was always in the culture. It was okay. And then when I grew older and I saw like some colleagues will say, if I work abroad more than 2 months, I need a company to provide for me so that I could bring my family with me. And it never occurred to me because I never experienced that as a kid myself. So in that sense, it was not that strange for me. I think what was strange or crazy because pandemic hit and then they couldn't do this once per year reunion with their families. And then some of them were stuck sort of in CAR already for 3 years, CAR meaning Central African Republic. And they took it up because they still feel this kind of sacrifice is legit because I am, tripling my salary or that I can provide for my family. So I think eventually, if we talk about value, it comes down to first, you got to be responsible. You have this responsibility for your family. Just like that joke, Asians smell responsibility. I think we do have that cultural burden on ourselves. But then I really like what Luan shared, that he wants to live a life with dignity. I think that's very important for him. And then also important for him is to let his son live a better life. So these two goals are really important for him so that he can, suck up all this bitterness and sacrifice. And I could feel dignity in him, especially when he's working and when he's talking to his family. I think this capability of providing for the family provides him with a dignity that he could feel as in family or when he is out there working. So yeah,
But you mentioned his son and the difficulties, and his son was drifting away from the family. The mother and the son got into fights, and then also his wife, the mother of his child too, tried to take her own life. Can you speak to some of the pain that you captured in the film on that side of the family?
Right. In the beginning, we didn't know about this. And then we just knew his wife swears sometimes because she was not happy. Yeah, a lot. And then Luan, in the beginning, some of his colleagues told me Luan would speak with his wife secretively. I was like, what does that even mean? In the end, we realized he did not want other people to hear her swearing. But then he explained that because my wife is suffering. And I know by just, cursing a little bit, he would be it would give her some relief. So I just listen. So it's 10 years of separation, meaning like, of course, they love each other, but Luan goes home once per year. And then
That's a long time.
That's a very long time. And then imagine all that accumulated depression and isolation and anxiety that how his wife feels in this 10 years. So she might not know that she's been suffering for 10 years, but she knows she's not happy. Things are getting worse. And then she resorted to some, radical behavior. And yeah, she didn't think through. But of course, in hindsight, she was like, I should not have done that, blah, blah, blah. But it's not like she understood. She might be going through some PTSD, but all this knowledge, she doesn't have it. But she's expressing all these emotions to Luan, and Luan gets her. This is why they're so affectionate towards each other. It's really moving for me to see as well.
Mathieu, you are bringing in the story a very human side. When people are going to watch it, they're going to see a very human side of the Chinese presence in Africa. Because when we talk about that, sometimes we only see big names, big companies, we see big directors, we saw, big names and all. We tend to forget that that's human level, that human connection. All throughout the documentary, we see the interaction that Luan has with these local workers, with these people in Central African Republic. He goes party with them, he dances with them for his birthday. They touch him. There is that human connection, that human interaction. So what can you tell us about what you've seen yourself in that, the way he was able to mix himself with the local community, to live through the reality, to also see, and yet to remain critical of their certain behavior, but he was still with them, he was still living with them?
Yes, I think that it's about immigration. And, I moved to the US. And so at first, when you move somewhere that you don't know, you are close to your community and you are only with your people. And that's what Luan was doing at first. But what was really interesting about him, and I think that maybe it's also because of his background and poverty and how he respects people who work hard. But there was definitely in Luan a person who really wanted to not only work in the Central African Republic, but also connect with the locals, connect with the culture. So he would, leave the compound and he would go to the local market and to buy fruits and buy all kind of local products. And same when he's working with locals, I think that he can see people who are sacrificing a lot, who are working hard to achieve their goals. So yeah, I think that Luan is really special in that sense that for him, it's important to cultivate his Chinese identity, but it was also important for him to connect with locals, because connecting with locals is also how you can achieve a better work. That's how you can deliver, a bank, buildings. And he's really smart the way he approaches locals.
Yeah, you could tell that. Yeah.
Eric, you really can see that. And Eric, you really know something that was really interesting, even when Mathieu mentioned connect. It reminds me the criticism that we often hear when they compare the Chinese presence in Africa in terms of comparing to the Western presence in Africa, where you're going to see a lot of comment coming from locals saying that, Chinese are much more closer to us. They're willing to live in places where we do live. They're willing to buy things in the same market that we do. It's quite different from what we see from the Westerners, the way they behave. But yet you see that connection. But it was really interesting to see Thomas, despite that Thomas saying that, in the beginning he was saying they are not different from the whites. They still make more money that we do. And I was like, that's quite interesting. At the same time, he sees them being close to them, but at the same time, he also sees them being quite different from them as well.
Yeah, Ningyi, let's pick up on that because early on in the film, there was a phrase, and if you didn't pay attention to it, you would have missed it, where one of the Central African Republic characters said, "This is not a win-win relationship."
Exactly.
And that was interesting to me because, of course, for those who follow the China-Africa relationship, that is how Xi Jinping and the Chinese government frame their relationship between China and Africa, Shuangying, win-win. And when this worker, one of the sand divers, said, "This is not win-win." And then you told me a very interesting story that when you showcased the documentary in China, none of it was censored, and that phrase was kept in. So can you speak to two issues here? Number one, this issue that Geraud picked up about the inequity that exists within the relationship between the Chinese in car and the local workers and whether or not it's win-win, and this question of the reception it got in China and why they didn't pick up on that, do you think?
This inequity is always there, and it almost has translated into a mentality that Central Africans sometimes, or most of the time, they have it, where foreigners, meaning white people, always make more money than we do. And they think this way.
Is that true, though? I mean, is it legit?
I think in some way it is true. Because, if on Luan's side, I travel so far, I'm so away from my family. It's going to be worth it, right? I got to be making more money. I'm a sort of expat. And the expats make more money than locals. If they make the local salary, then why would Luan even travel all this far? And then for a local person, like you came to my country, youth are thriving, and then it seems like there is a lot of international money coming in. Why am I still poor? It's great that Chinese people pay really on time. It's great, but I'm not your manager. You brought your own Chinese managers. Why don't you train me to become a manager? Right? But it doesn't mean that Central Africans do not have the opportunity because, Eric, you also know this. There's so many Africans, they went to China, they study Chinese, they speak Mandarin. And then they could be trained to go to the manager level. But most of them are being translators, interpreters for these Chinese companies. So I think there is that inequity, but it takes away the humanity if you just side with one side. I think there is some complexity there. And then, of course, eventually you want to create a company where everybody makes some money and then everybody earns their salaries based on merit. But it's not that simple. Do you have enough talents? Can you call that unfair if you just bring in your own people because it's easier to communicate and they have the expertise? So there's a lot there to unpack. But I understand if we say, this is not fair, they always make less money. And I know that mentality, like my sound person, Aaron, he said, sometimes I think we should change our mindset. I was like, what do you mean? Because sometimes Chinese or Lebanese, they come to us for opportunities, but Central Africans are so proud they would reject that because they know they will make less money. I didn't know about this. I was like, that's interesting perspective. And then Ahon says, we should not think that way. We should just, see what we can learn, see what we can provide, and then we negotiate a deal that everybody is happy with. But I feel like I can understand all sides.
Yeah, so let me just ask you, how much of what Ningyi is saying about the Central African Republic resonates with you about what you see in the Democratic Republic of Congo? That's my reference point, and I saw a lot of similarities from the time that I lived in Kinshasa to what was happening in Bangui. But tell me a little bit about what you're thinking when you hear what Ningyi is saying about the dynamic between Chinese and locals in the inequity.
which is exactly spot on. It's the same mentality, the same feeling that you see and you perceive from locals in Kinshasa or in Lubumbashi or elsewhere in DRC, that perception like the Chinese are making more money than we do. Not even the Chinese, all the expats are making more money than we do. And they have that sense of saying, especially in the DRC, I think even in the Central African Republic and even elsewhere, there's a feeling that, we have our own colonial background stories and everything related to a non-Black individual coming as an expat, being Chinese, being Indians, being Pakistani, being Western, coming to our countries, that we go to the base that they're making more money than we do. And we tend to compare the position and our own position. For instance, you're going to have a local worker on a very, I'd say, on the kind of low level of the working ladder, but going to complain that his manager is making more money, his Western or Chinese manager making more money. And you'd be like, yes, first of all, you don't have the same position. So it's quite, even if he was not Chinese, you're still going to make less money than he does. But now him being Chinese, of course, because he's expat and everything, he's making more money. And when Ningyi mentioned that the local employee will speak Chinese, in the documentary, we see that they have an interpreter that was there who's speaking Chinese as well. You can see at the moment I was like, why didn't he become himself a manager as well? And that also speaks to you about the kind of approach that many Chinese companies had and still have. It's to a certain extent when they come to Africa. It's easy because of the language barrier. And they mentioned it in the beginning that the language barrier has been something really difficult to overcome sometimes. They need a translator to help and work and everything. And easily the translator become the interface between the locals and the Chinese. When they want to say something, say, tell him, you speak to him. Maybe he's going to understand you more than he understands us. It become like a very tricky situation for the interpreter to find himself as if he was like the bridge between the two sides, and sometimes he can be perceived as a good or bad person. It's really interesting position the interpreter has in those contexts.
Ningyi, tell us a little bit about the reception in China that you had when you screened the film.
We screened twice during the Shanghai International Film Festival. I was definitely surprised that they didn't ask us to take out those two sentences. They're like right against the general lines, usually in the mainstream media in China. I do not know why. Honestly, when I was making this film, as I told you in the beginning, we thought it was going to be a short film, and then it was developing into a feature. And then this is an international team. I cannot just say, hey, I think we're going to play in China. Let's take out this sentence because we're going to be censored anyways, right? I have to respect Pascal's view. I have to respect, Matt's perspective and also our editor. So there was never a moment that I would censor myself in that sense. But I think in the post-production phase, there was some self-censorship, maybe like, oh, how am I going to tell the story? But it's great to work in an international team. You are in no position to impose your own narrative.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then
how did people respond to those lines? And how did they respond to the film as a whole? And were you showing it to expats in China, or were you showing it to Chinese?
Oh, Chinese is just a general audience. And then people loved it.
Okay. What did they say? What was their feeling about it?
They really loved Luan and his wife. And then I don't think they picked much on that sentence about win-win. Sometimes, I think Chinese, they know what's going on, right? They have their own judgment. They wouldn't say it. They wouldn't say like, oh, I don't agree with this. I don't agree with that. I don't think it's win-win. Of course, I think they have their own analysis if this is win-win whenever Chinese invest so much abroad. And as you said, sometimes Chinese do not even disclose information how much we're investing abroad, right? So I think they didn't pick on that line particularly, but I think Chinese know that One Belt, One Road is not always win-win.
Talking about perception here, in China, when they see Laurent's story, when they see the interaction with the local communities, when they see lives in local communities in Central African Republic, what were the comments they had? What was the perception? What seeing like, wow, this is how Central African Republic is. How they reacted to that?
I think they get what I wanted to present, which is humanity connects us all. Like we all struggle with poverty. We all struggle. We all want to provide better for our family and for ourselves. So they understand that ambition. But some of the Chinese audiences also wanted us to go a little bit geopolitical. Those civil war, or I don't know what they are really expecting. And honestly, if I really were to make a political sort of geopolitical film, I would rather do it after I'm 40, because I think that takes time to really form a mature political view, because our names are attached to these films forever. And I wanted to show this film to whomever that I meet, not like only people who know about the politics, not only people who are Chinese. So in that sense, I'm pretty happy that they understand the emotional connection between the two communities, at least the similarities they share.
Well, the story of Chinese going overseas and living difficult lives working is not new to Chinese audiences. Ningyi, you and I were talking about earlier about a drama series from, I think, the 1990s called Beijing 在纽约, which is Beijing in New York, that told the story of, it was like a multi-part TV drama of Chinese migrants to New York and how difficult their life was. And so I think this has been a theme both in Chinese life and also in Chinese entertainment for generations, because the Chinese have eaten bitter not just in Africa, but in the United States, in the Americas, all over the world. So it's not an uncommon theme. Mathieu, let's wrap up our discussion with a little bit on the business side of things. That's what you as a producer do. You've entered this into a number of film festivals. You've already run one run. What's the plan here? How does this work? So you're going to show this in these film festivals. It's not for wide release. So if people listening to the show, invariably they're going to say, great, I want to watch this documentary that you guys have spent the past 40 minutes talking about. Where can I watch it? How does it work so that eventually larger audiences, besides the bougie crowds that go to film festivals, will actually be able to see it?
Yeah, so we've been very lucky to be selected to so many like film festivals across the world. So you just go on the Itbida website and you can see when it's going to play in your city, in your town. But yeah, the idea is like to go through like the film festival run for a year or a year and a half. And we are talking to different, distributors. So hopefully it's going to be either on a global streaming platform in the coming year, or we are just going to sell the rights to national TV's networks. And we will keep everyone posted on our website for sure, but that's how it works now. And
so the goal is, so just so I understand, the goal is to sell it to a Netflix or a Max.
Yes.
And then everybody can see it. Or if that doesn't work, then you go station by station. So Antenne 2 in France, FR3, NBC, and you have to then license it one by one.
I'm waiting more for the African public as well, because it's an African story. People be like waiting when they're going to see it on the TVs, on the station, when, or what's the approach?
But they don't spend a lot in licensing television, though, Geraud. That's the problem in Africa.
We are talking to BBC Africa and we are talking to absolutely, and I hear you, we want a worldwide distribution and we definitely want a distribution in Africa. So we are working towards that. And we are running for an Oscar. We submitted the film, so hopefully we'll be
Really?
shortlisted. Yes. That's
That is fantastic.
Yeah, that's nice.
very hard because you are talking about business. You need like a publicist, you need like $500,000 if you want to have like a proper Oscar campaign. But as everything else, we've been doing that, Ningyi, Pascal, and we've been doing everything from the get-go. So we are working on a grassroots campaign and hopefully, we'll be shortlisted. We'll see.
And then we can say, Geraud, we knew them when. So when they win the best documentary film at the Oscars, we'll say we knew them when. And then we'll take a little bit of credit for their success. Just a tiny bit.
I'm advocating for the African audience because for me, it really touches me a lot to really see that human side of a single Chinese story, a one-person story. For me, I'm really hoping when it's going to be public, when people are going to be able to see that people in Africa, they're going to have the opportunity to see that behind the big companies, beyond that Chinese manager who speaks a language they don't understand, there is a man with his own story, with his own struggle, with his own worries. He's just human like you. And sometimes it just takes us to be human to understand each other, that we are all in the same path, in the same journey for survival.
And the other way is true too, because Pascal, one of the things that he was talking about, Thomas, everyone in the Central African Republic, the locals are looking down on the sand divers because they don't have like a lot of opportunities. They don't have like, education, and some of them come from like the rebels. So they are really poor and everyone is looking down on them. But she said that since Itbida has been screening in the Central African Republic, people have changed and a lot of people came to her telling her, well, now when I walk along the river and I see the sand divers, I'm not looking down on them anymore. And I know that thanks to them, my city, Bangui, is booming, and we need these people, and they're doing like a tremendous job. So I think that it was also important to show like the reality and who are these people who basically every day can die, because when we were filming that film, 7 sand divers died. Every day Thomas can basically either drown, have like a heart attack when he's underwater, and it's very dangerous. So kudos to these people.
Definitely. Thomas is so happy now. He's a star now. He comes to every private screening. He definitely feels like a star, but he is the star in the show.
Well, he is the star, and well-deserved. We're going to put a link to all the film festival showings are in the show notes, so you can see if it's coming to a city near you. If you are here in New York City, November 9th is going to be the big day here. I cannot recommend this enough. And again, want to emphasize people who really deserve some credit. Again, this was Ningyi Sun, who was the director, but her co-director, Pascal Nikindi, also deserves equal amounts of credit for what is an amazing job. And again, another very important point of this was directed by Chinese and African women. And I think that also is super important. And then again, if anybody gets an Oscar, I really believe you two deserve it, but no one deserves it more than Orphée Zaza Emmanuel Bamoy, who on the cinematography was just unbelievable. I mean, it gave me chills watching. It was stunning. And so no disrespect to either one of you, but Orphée is... I've never met Orphée, but you know what? My hat's off, because I know what that job is, and it is hard. So Mathieu, Ningyi, congratulations. Thank you both for taking the time out of your incredibly busy schedules to tell us about this important work. And we will be cheering for you at all of the film festivals, and hopefully with Netflix, and hopefully then on to the Oscars. Congratulations.
Thank you so much, Eric and Geraud. It was lovely talking to you.
Thank you.
Geraud, if we sound effusive about this and so excited, it's because, again, it's so refreshing to see this humanity in the relationship. And in many ways, what I saw in this film echoed a lot of what I've seen on the ground over the years, nowhere near as much as what you've seen on the ground and what you've heard about. And so I think while the story is about the Central African Republic, it's easy to draw parallels to elsewhere on the continent.
Exactly. Yeah. It's really easy to really see what's happening, to really kind of see yourself in those stories, to see your community, to see your people, to kind of now from that movie to kind of understand when I see the Chinese close to Congo River talking to a local buying sand, I'm kind of understanding now what's happening there. And beyond that Chinese with his uniform, there is a man who's just struggling, who's also fighting. There is a dynamic that's happening there. There are complaints. There are just hopes. And maybe that Chinese I'm looking at right now, I kind of see this man hasn't been home in the last 4 or 5 years, or in the last 10 years, he's been home once every year or once every 2 years. You kind of now put that humanity side into the narrative, and it changes your perspective. It really changes your perspective, and it puts you in a place where you kind of be more patient. You just understand the complexity of this relationship, of this dynamic, and you understand there are a lot of nuance that you need to input into the narrative before judging anybody.
You know, when you and I have had the chance to speak with senior level Chinese officials and stakeholders, one of the things that we've said over the years is that if they only relaxed a little bit and let more access in, because in many respects, they have a good, powerful story to tell.
Exactly.
But because the feeling is that they've been burned so many times by the Western media and by foreigners with cameras who are going to come in and tell a story of, you know, how the Chinese are exploiting or abusing or doing all those things, they figure they don't want to talk. They just say no. In some ways, they're not wrong. I mean, I remember there was a Dutch documentary team that came to the Congo when I was there, and this team has done it several times where they were given access and then use that access to basically promote those kind of typical narratives that the Chinese are exploiters, and, you know, here they're eating by themselves, and you see how they're, you know, and just tiny little things, and you're like, oh, now I get it, that they want to kind of just say, go away, get out of my face, I don't need you here. But as we can see, when the stories are done well, it really, really does a lot to soften the edges of some of those toxic narratives.
It's really tell a compelling story, a human story where you just understand. And when you watch the movie, you kind of pick up on certain elements that later on become geopolitical narrative that feed into NGO reports and everything. You kind of understand why certain things happen the way they happen, why certain incidents, if we have to call them that way, happen the way they happen when they do happen. You understand that if the context behind those situations, behind those sometimes those strained, difficult relationship between Chinese and local workers stem sometimes from very basic, simple misunderstanding that goes from the language, the tones of the voice, anything. Just it goes in every direction. And then in that exact moment, those are the part that the NGO story they don't tell, that the big Western media they don't tell. But that documentary here shows you those little bits of story that you kind of, now I understand better the circumstances. I understand better the context here.
Well, I do hope that everybody has the chance to watch it. It's called Eat Bitter. Again, it's making its rounds on the film festival circuit. Seems like it might be another year or two, though, before it is widely available on streaming and or on television. But I think these guys seem like they know what they're doing. So if there's a shot, they're going to do it. And I think your point, and I just want to echo it, of this being shown on African television networks and in African cinemas is critical. Absolutely critical. Oftentimes, these types of art house documentaries are seen in the Upper West Side of New York and in Paris and in London, but they don't really make it out to China and to Africa.
Exactly. In Kinshasa or in Nairobi or anything else.
That's right. And that's so important. And what it does is it tells a complex story. There's no simple narrative here. There's no villain. There's no, hero. Everybody's just struggling. And that's what we want people to take away from the whole discussion about China-Africa. I always say when I give talks on China-Africa relations, I always tell everybody, I want you to leave this conversation less clear, more muddled, more confused than how you started it. Because people oftentimes come into the conversation with their mind made up. The Chinese are this, Africans are that, Westerners are this, and okay, I've got it figured out. And movies like this and discussions like this and your experiences as well really serve to undermine those simple narratives. And that's what we hope people take away, not only from this movie, but from even the work that we're doing.
And this is our goal. We really do hope at the end that people will understand that things are not so easy. Sometimes they're portrayed on different media. They are much more complex. And we would like you really to understand the complexity and to being able to make your own judgment based on facts that you see on those complexity. And we're all going to win by having that much more nuanced approach in the situation.
That is the perfect way to end our discussion. Of course, if you really treasure this nuance that you see in the film and also in the discourse, then you will want to subscribe to the work that Geraud and Cobus and Johnny and Antonia and the entire CGSP team in Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. Remember, our team is all based in the Global South. I'm here in New York for 1 week, but that's it. I need to get out of here. I don't like it here. I need to go back to Vietnam. And that really creates a very different perspective than when you're sitting here in New York, the world looks different. When you're in Washington, the world looks different. And I think it's impossible to cover these countries and these cultures from a place like New York, London, or Paris. You have to be living in those countries in order to understand what's going on. And that's what we do every single day. We have about 25 governments around the world who subscribe to our service, dozens of universities, and we would love for you to join our growing reader community. Go to ChinaGlobalSouth.com/subscribe. You'll get a 30-day free trial to see if you like it. If you are a student or a teacher, and we know that you guys don't have a lot of money, we have a 50% discount for you. Just email me, eric@ChinaGlobalSouth.com, and I will send you the links for a 50% discount. Please use your academic email, and that way I can know you're a student, and we'd love to have you part of our reader community. So let's leave our conversation there. Geraud and I and the team will be back again next week with another episode of the China in Africa podcast for Geraud Nima in Mauritius. I'm Eric Olander. Thank you so much for listening.
The discussion continues online. Tag us on Twitter @ChinaGS Project and visit us at chinaglobalsouth.com. If you speak French, check out our full coverage at projetafriquechine.com and Afriquechine on Twitter. That's Afrique with a K. And you'll also find links to our sites and social media channels in Arabic.